Everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are of course talking about the 3.5 hour long interview that Joe Rogan posted today with Elon Musk. I would definitely say it's worth listening to the full interview, but if you don't have 3.5 hours, we'll try to hit the high points here in 10 minutes or so. The other topic I wanted to discuss is the Edmunds electric vehicle range test. I've been getting some questions on that over the last couple of days. Seems to be getting quite a bit of attention, so we'll talk a bit about that as well. Quick look at the stock. Tesla today finished up 0.9% to $811.66. That compared to the NASDAQ up 0.4%. All right, so getting into the interview with Elon Musk, I think this is the third time he's been on with Joe Rogan. Nothing too scandalous. There were some, I would say, salacious parts of the podcast today, but nothing too scandalous. My take is that Elon seemed pretty well. He seemed relaxed. He seemed comfortable. He seemed happy. He talked about sleep. They actually started off there. So this has been something that, I don't know, I guess Tesla investors have been a little bit concerned about with Elon Musk over the past few years. He did say that right now he's getting about 6 hours of sleep per night on average, and that in the past he's of course tried sleeping a lot less, but he has found that his total productivity has decreased when that has happened, and he said he doesn't find himself wanting more sleep. So I thought that was a nice little update. Good way to start the interview off. So the first thing I want to talk about is Elon's comments on various different Tesla products. We'll start off with the Roadster here. I know we're all very curious on timing updates there. So was Joe Rogan. He asked about it. Elon said they're finishing the engineering this year, and they're hopefully starting shipping it next year. That then led into a conversation around that engineering, and Elon said that, they're putting rocket technology in the vehicle. Joe Rogan said, yeah, I've heard about that, so tell me a little bit more about it. Elon at that point started to say, at minimum, and then Rogan interrupted him and asked, will it hover? Elon said, I want it to hover, but then how do we make it hover without being dangerous and killing people? Then he said, quote, I thought maybe we could make it hover, but not too high. So maybe it can hover like a meter above the ground, something like that, end quote. Then saying maybe something like 6 feet, because if you were to plummet, well, you might hurt the suspension of the Roadster, but you'd probably survive. And this is something they would potentially do with what they would call a SpaceX option package, which would actually replace the back seats of the Roadster, which are obviously very small, with a high pressure gas thruster tank at about 10,000 psi. After talking about hovering, Elon got back into his original point about incorporating rocket technology in the Roadster, saying that he's confident at minimum they could do a thruster in the license plate area. He said flipping the license plate down. I doubt they would actually do it that way because of legal concerns, but in that area, and he said that would give them 3 tons of thrust. Hopefully some of our more physics-inclined listeners can do some math on that and see what that might mean for acceleration. Anyway, my point about how that conversation unfolded and the grammatical structure that Elon used during the hovering portion of that conversation, I think it's unlikely that that ends up making its way into a product. I think Elon likes talking about it and thinking about it because it adds to the cachet of the Roadster, and it's something they could achieve technically, but I think actually implementing it probably is just one headache too many. And really, to what end? I mean, do you really want your car to be 1 or 2 meters off the ground for a short period of time? Not that the Roadster is an exercise in practicality from the beginning, but you're probably going to get a lot more use out of the insane acceleration than you are hovering. Relevant to this point was also something that was brought up much later in the conversation. Rogan was asking about the range of the Roadster, and Elon said, well, we'll have to decide what is the best product, stuff you can do for bragging rights, but bragging rights get old fast. And then he settled by saying that it'll have enough range that you'll never have to worry about it. And of course, Tesla has unveiled it and lists it at 620 miles. Since the Cybertruck came out and was listed at 500 plus miles, a lot of people have been expecting, oh, well, the Roadster can do quite a bit more than that. And I think, sure, again, something that's technically possible here. But Musk was saying you could have a gas tank that lets you go 2,000 miles before filling up, but at a certain point, there's just diminishing returns, and those can make for a worse product. Especially in the case of a Roadster where you're not going to be doing, presumably any towing or anything like that. 620 miles should be more than enough. And even if you're tracking the car, sure, more capacity would be helpful, but again, in the track, weight is very important, and the more battery capacity you add, the more weight you have. Anyway, even though Elon's comment there about bragging rights getting old fast was in reference to range, I think that also applies to the whole hover car situation. Next on the product list here was the Plaid Model S, quite a bit of discussion on this. The big news here is on performance. Elon said that the Motor Trend Spec 0 to 60 test came in at 1.96 seconds. So far, all we had heard from Tesla was less than 1.99 seconds, and I don't know, for some reason to me, having this 1.96 second time makes it more real now. And Elon's example here didn't hurt making it more real because he said 0 to 60 in 1.96 seconds. That gets you to 60 before the end of the intersection. I think I've sort of been, a little bit mentally writing off the Plaid because it's not the Plaid Plus, and the Plaid Plus is just going to be even crazier, but the Plaid in and of itself is already so completely crazy that you can't really describe it, so Plaid is a very fitting name. As for the Plaid Plus, Elon did say on the timeline there that it's maybe a year from now. Of course, the design studio says late 2021, But to me, this did come as a really natural, not sandbagged or considered response. It was kind of just, yep, maybe a year from now. So I don't think anyone should be expecting that earlier than late 2021, and it might even be a little bit after that. Anyway, the other performance element that they talked about was the track time at the Nürburgring. Elon said that they're trying to get the Plaid to a low 7-minute mark on the Nürburgring. It wasn't clear to me if that's the Plaid or the Plaid Plus. Nürburgring times were something we talked a lot about last year, as Porsche at that time with the Taycan had actually captured the 4-door all-electric sedan record with a time of 7:42 around the Nürburgring. And that was what sort of brought out the conversation about the Plaid Model S from Tesla, if I remember correctly. So Elon said low 7 minutes, and he thinks with further improvements they could even get it below 7 minutes. I'm sure that would at least be the Plaid Plus, which Elon said, as far as he knows, would be the fastest time for a production vehicle. Obviously, modified vehicles have exceeded that, but Elon said there's potential here for Tesla to have a car that, as delivered, can beat that 7-minute time. Next up were just a few updates on the Cybertruck. Elon said that they've reduced the size of the vehicle by about 3%. I don't think that's new information. I think he said that on other occasions. He also again discussed timeline, as he has in the past, but he used a little bit different language here. Before he said, if Tesla gets lucky, if everything goes well, they could produce some Cybertrucks this year. Here he said, quote, probably limited production end of this year, end quote. Not something I'm going to read too much into, but definitely better than seeing the verbiage slip in the other direction. And then of course, for volume production, he said next year. They talked a little bit about the Cybertruck unveiling, stuff that we've heard by now, but he talked about the demo glass, how they'd been throwing steel balls at that all day to test it out. I think he said a dozen people had done it. So of course, perhaps that weakened it, or banging it with a sledgehammer weakened it, maybe introducing a hairline fracture. But he also interestingly here talked about how the demo glass is not as robust as production glass would be, because it is sort of a one-off thing. You don't get to use all of the massive, expensive production equipment that would go into the production vehicle glass. So I thought that was an interesting detail that I don't think we've heard before. Rogan then asked about potentially using solar panels on the Cybertruck. Elon said they could maybe do something with the cover for the truck bed, but the best case, you're probably looking at something like 10 miles per day if you're lucky. Interestingly, that kind of led into a conversation about Tesla making a van, and Elon said that for a van, solar might start to actually make sense, because in a van situation, you might have enough surface area on the van to get something more like 30 miles per day. That brought up a conversation around camping and having the potential to have an expandable solar array. And Elon said something like that would be really cool. That seemed to be sort of his threshold for interest for solar vehicle integration. I think that gets into the market that Rivian seems to be trying to target, that more outdoors adventure type of consumer. But having a mobile power source and having the ability to store that mobile power in your vehicle while you're camping, something like that just seems like an amazing feature to have. So hopefully something like that materializes from Tesla someday, and I think the next logical step on that is an RV, especially combined with autonomy. That's going to be a killer product. I suppose that leads into comments on the next product here, and that's the Semi, which interestingly came up as a result of Joe Rogan asking Elon Musk about Bill Gates' comments on the Semi. You may remember those from a blog post last August when Gates wrote, quote, even with big breakthroughs in battery technology, electric vehicles will probably never be a practical solution for things like 18-wheelers, cargo ships, and passenger jets, end quote. So Elon Musk in response basically said Bill Gates doesn't know what he's talking about in this area. He's not close enough to it to have that understanding. And really interestingly here, Musk said that he has heard through friends that Gates actually had a big short position against Tesla. So obviously that's not verified, that's just what Musk said that he had heard. As for the Semi, Elon said, of course it works. We have prototypes right now that have a range of around 300 miles or so. He mentioned for the Semi, you want a battery pack of around 500 kilowatt hours. So that seems to be roughly where they're at for that 300 mile variant. And then he made an interesting comment here on autonomy. He said for the Semi, quote, eventually it will be autonomous, but we're still a ways away from that. But in the short term, I think we can certainly see convoys, end quote. So a couple of interesting things there. Elon's comment on fully autonomous Semi being a ways away seems like a stark contrast to what he's been touting this year for full self-driving. Even though on the earnings call, someone asked, hey, when you take full self-driving over to the Semi, is that a big deal? Or do you pretty much just say you're driving a Semi now instead of a Model 3? And Elon said, yep, that's pretty much it. There are a few differences, but sounds like they're relatively trivial. So I don't know, maybe Elon is thinking fully autonomous where there's just no driver at all here, which is maybe a little bit different than what he's talking about with the consumer fleet. Or maybe he happened to be thinking about regulations at that point in time. Who knows? But then the convoy idea, this is nothing new. This is something that we saw Tesla actually do a mock-up of, virtual mock-up of, at the Semi unveiling. But if you're not familiar with that, that has a driver in the lead vehicle, but then maybe two trailing vehicles that just don't have a driver at all and are operating fully autonomously following the lead. For something like that, I think Tesla would be pretty much there today, especially if they have the capability of doing some sort of remote operation in the case where I don't know, some weird situation pops up where the convoy needs assistance. So that was the Semi. Rogan pushed hard on asking about a possible electric vertical takeoff and landing jet from Tesla. Elon said, quote, "Thought about planes for a long time, but my brain will explode if I do planes," end quote. Rogan pushed again, asking if possibly Tesla could expand to planes in the future. He said it could, but it's really a different regime. He said the car makers right now aren't making planes. I got to imagine that one of them is somehow involved in some way, but he's just making a broad point there. Rogan then pushed a final third time and said, "Is that something that could be next for Tesla?" And Elon said, quote, "I hope not," end quote. He said there's other companies, a lot of smart people that are working on that, and hopefully they would achieve it so that Tesla doesn't have to. This kind of also brought in the conversation of Tesla's future and Elon's future. And again, as he has said recently, he said he's committed for several years to be the CEO of Tesla. There's still a lot to do. So those were kind of all the comments on products, but there were a few other things noteworthy in this interview that I just want to kind of list off here. They talked about Tesla's safety, and they had a pretty lengthy conversation about the airbag design at Tesla, or maybe not design, but operation. Elon said that they dynamically control the software of the airbags based on the weight and the positioning even of the passenger in the vehicle. So whether you're sitting central in the seat or somewhere on the edge or on the side, the airbags adjust for that. And he also said that over time, they're obviously updating that like they do so many other features over the air. So some cool insight there that I don't think I've heard Tesla share before. Probably something they don't get enough credit for. Elon said that, of course, they don't have to do that from a regulation perspective, but on safety things, they go way above and beyond regulatory requirements. Another part of the conversation that I found noteworthy was on the original Roadster. Elon, as he has said in the past, said that they would have been better off starting from scratch than actually using any part of the Lotus Elise, just because they had to do so much rework and it still ended up not being optimal and became even more expensive to do it that way. Just all around led to a lot of problems. He also talked about how sometimes it's easier to knock down a house than build a new one. And I wanted to share this because I think it's relevant to conversations we have a lot, whether that's about Tesla acquiring another automaker or Tesla buying up factories from automakers that are shutting them down. Obviously, they went through that with the Numi acquisition when they were really first getting started, but Tesla's at a whole new level now. And with their focus on every factory being better than the last factory, more efficient, being quicker to get up to speed, I definitely think Tesla's at the point where it's just much easier to build a new factory from a clean plot of land than to try to shoehorn Tesla's technology into an older factory. And then as far as acquiring a legacy automaker, just apply that across the entire organization. The last thing here on Tesla that I thought was relevant, and this is also related to the older Roadster, Elon talked about the situation where Tesla had actually, when they're just getting started, lent a Roadster out to Top Gear for one of their episodes. And that resulted in Top Gear producing this episode that showed the Roadster breaking down, having all these other issues. Tesla ended up suing Top Gear for libel and malicious falsehood. And Elon here on Rogan shared a detail that at least I hadn't heard before, which was that as a part of the script for this episode, before they even drove the car, so the script of the episode, they had the Roadster breaking down. When Tesla pushed back on this, Top Gear apparently replied, "This is just entertainment, it's not meant to be true." That's the kind of stuff that Tesla had to deal with to get where they are today, not an easy task. So those were the main things on Tesla. The rest of the conversation, obviously a lot of conversation on Mars, some on climate change. They did talk about Starlink, so probably the most relevant thing to that is that Elon did say that, hey, Starlink is great for low and medium density, but actually 5G cellular is better for high density. I know people have had varying points of view on that, so just something to keep in mind for eventually when we, I'm sure, start talking more about Starlink as a business. All right, so that wraps up the interview. Let's talk then about this Edmunds EV range test. Edmunds certainly figuring out how to get the Tesla community interest yesterday with a tweet saying, quote, "The fact is every single Tesla we've tested has failed to hit its EPA range estimate," end quote, while also noting that the Porsche Taycan outperformed its EPA range estimate by 60%. So looking at the article here, they've got a table with a bunch of different electric vehicles. The Taycan that I mentioned is the Porsche Taycan 4S. So that's the opening price, lowest performance version of the Taycan. They got 323 miles of range in their testing out of the Taycan versus the 203 mile EPA estimate. And then for Tesla's vehicles here, they have 5 different vehicles tested. Generally, they ended up missing from somewhere between 2.5% on the low end to 17% on the high end from the EPA estimates. So as with any range test, the first thing we need to look at is the methodology. Edmunds says, quote, "We aim for a mix of 60% city driving and 40% highway, assuming that most electric vehicle owners will likely spend more time in stop-and-go traffic than they will on the open highway. Since no electric vehicle has exactly the same range, the route length is adapted to suit each vehicle," end quote. They also note that EPA tests are done under the vehicle's default settings, but if there are more efficient drive modes or stronger regenerative braking, Edmunds will turn those on. Quote, as long as it doesn't affect safety or practical comfort levels, such as deactivating the climate control system or significantly reducing power for accelerating or maintaining appropriate highway speeds, end quote. So hopefully by now you're picking up on a lot of different things introducing variability into these tests. That 60-40 split, they just say that they aim to hit that, but every car is on a different route because every car has a different amount of range. That introduces a lot of variability. That's before considering the impacts of traffic or the way the vehicle is being driven by the test driver. They then say they target 10 miles of remaining range. Well, that introduces variability because automakers have different strategies for what they show as rated range. Some may use a buffer, potentially significant buffer on that, and some others may not. For whatever reason, something they're doing here seems to be particularly impactful for Tesla because Edmunds also shares the consumption efficiency. And in 4 out of 5 cases for the Tesla vehicles tested, they're actually getting the same or better efficiency than the EPA number. So they're beating the efficiency numbers, but not beating the range numbers. Doesn't really add up. For example, if we look at their 2020 Model S results, they say that they missed the EPA range by 2.5%, but beat efficiency by 7%, so a 9.5 point spread between those two. I was curious here, so I put these spreads in a table, and for some reason the variance on all the Tesla vehicles is higher than the variance on any of the other vehicles. So for Tesla, the average variance here is 10%, and it's pretty consistent. For the 9 other non-Taycan vehicles, the average is 1%, and that's actually 0.51%. I had to round up there, but presumably 0% is what you'd expect because that would mean that the efficiency number from the EPA is matching the range estimate from the EPA, which makes sense. And then at the bottom for the Taycan, for some reason, there's a huge variance here due the opposite direction. Edmunds got 59% more range than the EPA estimate, but only 34% better efficiency. Obviously 34% better efficiency, that's still really good. Not trying to knock the Taycan here. Seems pretty clear across multiple tests that the Taycan does outperform the EPA range, so that's great. But we're just trying to evaluate the results of these tests across the board. So to me, this looks like a big problem with where Edmunds chooses to stop the test that is affecting different cars differently. Continuing to introduce more variability, you then have the different driving modes that they choose to test the vehicles in. So for the Porsche Taycan, they drove it in range mode, as they clearly specify in their article comparing the range of the Taycan with the range of the Model Y. But for the Model Y, they make no mention of driving it in chill mode, for example. If the test is 60% city, that can make a really big difference. The last thing that I'll note is temperature. So Edmunds reports the average daily temperature that occurred on the day of the test. For some reason, they don't include just the average temperature over the course of the test. Not sure why that is. But for the Tesla vehicles, the average temperature those days was 63 degrees versus the Porsche Taycan, for example, was the highest at 73 degrees. That's not insignificant, and the variability could be even greater than that depending on what time of day the test took place. For example, I kind of had to laugh at this because you can sort the table by Edmunds' tested range, so you can see the highest, and the Porsche Taycan 4S comes in at the top with 323 miles, just barely edging out the 2020 Tesla Model S Performance at 318 miles. But the Model S Performance, the testing temperature that day was 60 degrees versus again the Taycan at 73 degrees. So that temperature probably ends up making the difference between the number 1 and number 2 slots on the table, but that's how it worked out. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that they happened to test the highest performance Tesla Model S versus the lowest performance Porsche Taycan. There's also no long-range Model 3 in there, which would also probably take that top slot. And given that those are Tesla's 2 longest range vehicles, you would think maybe if you're going to do a range test, they might be relevant. So anyway, I'm sure I'll get some comments today saying that, oh, this is just like fanboy defending Tesla. I'm just talking about the parameters of the test. If you don't think those critiques are valid, that's fine, let me know why, but simply the fact that this channel is called Tesla Daily has nothing to do with the critiques of the test. Personally, the test that I want to see is for someone to take these cars out, put them on the highway in the middle of the night so there's no traffic, take them with 100%, run them side by side on the same highway, the same speed, same road conditions, same weather, follow them with a couple trailers, pick them up when they can no longer safely drive on the highway, and that's your range test. Maximum range, I think, is much more important in a highway scenario than maximum range in mixed driving. I don't think many people are too concerned about their range in the city if you have access to charging, which more and more people will have over time. Doesn't mean city efficiency is completely irrelevant. Obviously, that's very important for things like a robotaxi fleet, but that's a little bit more about efficiency, not necessarily maximum absolute range. Now, I'm not really putting that on Edmunds. Obviously, the EPA test isn't just straight highway miles either, and we talk about those comparisons all the time. The reason for that is there's just no better standard that we have. But for me, that's what makes a third-party test of something like that so interesting. All right, so this one's getting a little bit long on me, and I know it's going to be out much later than usual. That 3.5-hour interview definitely sent me back a little bit today, but hopefully that was some helpful information. And as always, thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed and signed up for notifications. You can also find me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast, and I'll see you tomorrow for the Friday, February 12th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.